Okay, I think we can begin. So good morning and welcome to what is the fourth and final session of the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Center's fifth annual workshop on the economics of electricity policy and market. My name is Brian Navard. I'm an adjunct professor at Ivey, and I'll be your host today for this final session. So today's session is our keynote session, and we're very fortunate to have Professor Severin Borenstein from the University of California at Berkeley with us today. And Severin will be giving his thoughts on the efficient and equitable pricing for the energy transition. So we're in for a good discussion today. Before we begin though, I'd first like to thank the sponsors of today's event. That includes the Alberta Electric System Operator and Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator. I'd also like to thank the Ivey Energy Consortium and Mr. Ted Kernahan for their ongoing support of the work of the Energy Policy and Management Center. Finally, I would like to make an acknowledgement that the campuses of the Ivey Business School and Western University is situated in the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, and that this land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. So again, today's session, we're fortunate to have Severin Borenstein with us. And what we're going to do for today's session is Severin's going to speak for about 40 minutes on the topic. Severin is joined by our moderator today, Mr. Professor Guy Holborn, who's a professor of business economics and public policy, also the director of the Energy Center here at Ivey. So we're going to have Severin speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then open it up to questions. Guy will start off with some questions, and we encourage participation from the audience. Please, if you'd like to ask Severin a question directly, use the raise hand button, and we'll try and get you live so you can ask Severin your question. Or if you prefer, you can also use the Q&A question, and we'll try and monitor the Q&A function and ask your questions if there's some time. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Guy to start off today's session. Guy.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I'm pleased to welcome Severin Borenstein, who's giving our keynote address to round out our webinar series. Severin is the Grether Chair and Professor of Business and Public Policy at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. He's particularly well known for his work on electricity markets and electricity pricing, and also more generally for his work on energy policy and climate change. And importantly for our audience today, he's also been very active in advisory and regulatory roles in the electricity sector over a long period of time, and he currently serves on the board of the California Independent System Operator. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he's widely regarded as one of the world's leading energy economists, so we're really delighted that he's able to join us for the keynote today. So thank you very much, Severin, for joining us from California. We're looking forward to your presentation and to the discussion afterwards. So with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Guy. And for those of you wondering, behind me are the San Jacinto Mountains in Southern California. Those are some very old wind turbines in the foreground, but if you look far, far in the background, you'll see some newer ones that they have also built in that area. So let me share my screen here. There we go. So I am Severin Borenstein. I'm going to talk about work today that I have done jointly with Meredith Fowley and Jim Salee, colleagues at UC Berkeley and at the Energy Institute at the Haas School of Business, which is, by the way, Guy's alma mater. I have known Guy since he was in graduate school. This is work on that departs a little from the work that I've done most of my career, which was mostly on efficiency and market operations in electricity and energy markets more broadly. This looks more at equity, which of course is an increasing concern as we transition to a greener economy and think about how we're going to pay for that transition. And that's really the theme of this work. In some ways, it continues the themes that were discussed in the last session And particularly, this works particularly close to the work that Professor Bottle from MIT presented in the last session. Okay, so as many people know, California has been a leader in fighting climate change. We have had programs since the 1970s, actually, before climate change was really the main concern, on energy efficiency. California was really a leader in energy efficiency standards, introduced net metering for behind the meter solar in the 90s. We had a renewables portfolio standard that was introduced in 2002. The California Solar Initiative, known as the Million Roofs Initiative, in 2006, and then the Climate Solution Act, which was a real foundational part of global climate policy, because it was the first cap and trade program. It was the first program of any kind to put a price on greenhouse gases in most of the economy. We introduced the low carbon fuel standard, electric vehicle subsidies, and many other policies. So California has been very active in fighting climate change. It's also been hit hard by climate change. We've had wildfires. We're in a drought, more wildfires. We've had extreme heat events that went up into British Columbia this summer. More wildfires again, a record wildfire year last year. Most recently, flooding. We, in fact, just last Sunday at my house over the back of the hills in Berkeley, we got 7 inches of rain in one day, and then more wildfires. So we have been pretty hard hit by weather events that are closely tied to climate change. At the same time, we've taken a lot of actions to adapt to climate change. California is working hard and investing huge amounts in improving forest management. We are well behind the curve on that. We're improving water management and drainage, which is going to be incredibly important, both to avoid flooding and to capture the water that is increasingly going to come down as rain, it appears, rather than snow. We used to be able to use snow as a natural storage mechanism, and that seems to be less likely now, and we're going to have to capture more of it in reservoirs. And then defensive policies that are being discussed about rising sea levels. But this is expensive. It costs a lot of money to make those sorts of investments to respond to climate change, both the mitigation through renewables and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and through adaptation. Some of those costs have been paid for through the state budget and from federal budget allocations. Some of the costs have been paid by individuals complying with standards. And a lot of these costs are being paid through electricity rates, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Nearly all of the costs that we pay for through electricity rates in California are paid through volumetric rates. That is, we have almost no fixed charges. So when we finance any sorts of costs through electricity rates, that means raising the per kilowatt hour charge. So what we look at in this paper is, what's the impact of that? California does have one of the most generous low-income support programs. I put generous in quotes because, as I'm going to show you, even with the generous low-income programs, even low-income customers are hit by unusually high prices. We pay for the low-income program by raising rates for everyone else. And again, that raises the volumetric rates. California has also been leading the world in the way they do revenue choices to support climate and other social programs, because we pay for a far higher share of these programs through electricity rates than most other states and countries. And what we ask in this is that really a good leadership? And the answer is pretty clearly no, in a couple of dimensions. So let me start by talking about California's electricity rates. These are in US dollars, and the 3 dots, the pink, orange, and green dots, are the average residential rate for customers of the 3 large utilities in California: PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is my local utility up here in Northern California in the Bay Area. Southern California Edison, which is the large utility in Southern California that includes most of Southern California except the city itself of Los Angeles, which has a municipal utility. And San Diego Gas and Electric, which is the most southerly of the three utilities. And what you can see here is after the California electricity crisis in 2000-2001, California's rates were very high relative to the rest of the country. This is a box and whiskers plot. The white line is the median. The blue is the 25th and 75th percentile, or sorry, 25th and 75th percentile. And then the ends of the whiskers are the 5th and 95th percentile. So California got pretty expensive after the electricity crisis because we were paying for those enormous costs of the electricity crisis. Later in the decade, it came down and our rates were starting to get back to normal. And then what we saw is over the last decade, California's rates have once again taken off. Southern California Edison, much less so than PG&E and San Diego. And I'll come back to talk about that a little bit more. But we now have, once again, extremely high rates relative to the rest of the country. To give you a little bit of geography, for not everyone's probably completely tuned to this, PG&E is the Northern California utility, as I pointed out. It covers a huge amount of land, including quite a bit of rural land where many of the forest fires have been. Southern California Edison also covers quite a bit of land. Both of them have on the order of 4 million residential customers and 1 million commercial and industrial customers. San Diego covers a much smaller area, but it actually has 1 million customers still. So it's more dense than the other two utilities. Pacific Core up in the north does cover a fair amount of land, but has very, very few customers. That is an extremely rural area of California, and we are not focused on them. So what do we do here? We investigate a few questions. Why are California's volumetric rates so high? And going back to the slide that I showed you a couple minutes ago, these rates are on the order of twice as high. The average rates in California are about twice as high as the average rates in most of the rest of the Western United States. So if you look at all the other Western states, our prices are just about double the rest of the Western US, and just about double the average price in Canada. So we pay extremely high rates. Now, I know there's quite a bit of dispersion in California, and there are some provinces that also have very high rates, and some that are even higher than California. But the larger provinces in Canada are substantially cheaper than California is. So we look at why rates are so high, and we also compare those rates to the cost of providing the power. And I'm going to come back to this, the incremental cost of providing additional power, and find that rates are much higher than the incremental cost of the power that providing power. We then ask who's paying these costs, and we look at the distribution of how these costs are allocated across people of different income levels. And we find that it's disproportionately households who are at the lower end of the income spectrum. And then we think about how could we recover these costs in a more efficient and equitable way, and we propose some alternatives. So this paper does some empirical investigation, which we are continuing to do, and I'll talk about in deeper dive work at the household billing level. And then we actually think about, well, what are the alternatives, and sketch out how those alternatives would work. Okay. So let's start by reviewing a little basic economics. If we wanted to price electricity in an economically efficient way, how would we do that? And the answer is we'd like to have the price reflect social marginal cost. And we'd like to have that vary over time as cost changes. Now, because electricity is very costly to store, the cost of supplying electricity can differ massively, even from the middle of the day to the middle of the night on the same day. We can have huge fluctuation. So time variation in prices is efficient, but we also want prices to reflect the true cost of providing incremental electricity, so that when a customer making a decision of whether to consume more thinks about the trade-off, they're trading off against the full cost to society. Now, that social and social marginal cost means it also includes any spillovers such as pollution externalities. The marginal means that we're not going to, the price when somebody's trying to decide whether to consume more should reflect what is the cost of actually providing more. And that means not having other costs that perhaps are sunk costs or costs for other policies or programs. SMC captures all the incremental costs that electricity consumption imposes, including fuel costs and also externalities such as pollution. And if the price equals social marginal costs, consumers making decisions can make efficient decisions because they buy electricity when they value its use more than the cost to society of providing it, and they don't buy it if they value it less. So what we do is we estimate that efficiency benchmark for the 3 investor-owned utilities, and we compare it to the prices over the last decade. So this is the first step, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to focus mostly on PG&E, not just because it's my utility, but because it's sort of the middle case of the 3 utilities. Southern California Edison is somewhat less expensive. San Diego Gas and Electric is somewhat more expensive. So PG&E is sort of in the middle, and it's a pretty good representative case, but I'll show you the other 2 as well. So what we did is we dug into the cost of providing electricity. And California does a lot of this sort of analysis, so we luckily could benefit from some of the previous work that the regulator has done in California. And we looked into what is the incremental cost of providing electricity. And we actually do this on an hourly basis, but what I'm showing you is the annual average. And I'll just give you a rough idea of how this works. The 3 lowest stripes here are capacity costs. So these are costs that are associated with making sure you have enough capacity to provide electricity. And that's mostly at the peak time. So capacity costs are determined by peak consumption. But what we do here is we average that over all the hours. That's not how you'd want to actually collect it, but it's a good way to give you an idea of magnitudes here. Then what I see as a blue-gray area is energy cost. This is the actual cost in the wholesale market and what it costs on the margin to deliver additional energy. There's a tiny stripe that's ancillary services that if you're into electricity markets, you're familiar with. This is some of the voltage support and balancing services that an ISO has to provide. And then we value greenhouse gases. Now, you can see that over the years, the light blue also acquires a dark blue. The dark blue is actually the market cost of those greenhouse gas emissions through the California Cap and Trade program, which first started operating in 2013, which is why that's when that dark blue arrives. The light blue is the unpriced greenhouse gas emissions. And that's all of the greenhouse gas emissions back in 2010. And then we take out the market component starting in 2013. And then the very top, what I see as pink here, is losses. This has been sort of underappreciated, I think. And there's some interesting engineering that losses actually increase with the load on the system. So you get much higher, they increase exponentially with the load on the system. So you get much higher losses per kilowatt hour when there's a lot of demand than when there's less demand. We average that over all the hours, and that is part of the cost, and that sort of magnifies all of the other costs. This is for California, and it compares those the red line at the bottom, which is just the height of those marginal costs, the social marginal costs that I showed you before, to the actual electricity rates. And we do it for two rates. The average, two averages, the average of all customers who are not on the low income program, which in California is called the CARE program, California Alternative Rates for Electricity, and those customers who are on the CARE program. Now, the CARE program since about 2015 has been by law set at 30 to 35% below the rates for regular customers. And so that's why these gaps starting around 2015 are a fixed proportion. And what we show here is that as we get to more recent years, California's rates for non-CARE customers, for regular customers, are about 3 times the social marginal cost. But even for CARE customers, these are the low-income customers, the rates are nearly double social marginal cost. So it is the case that the CARE program is generous. It is subsidizing electricity at many kilowatt hours per, or many cents per kilowatt hour, but it's still ending up with prices that are well above social marginal cost and are actually well above the average price in most of the Western, in all of the Western United States. We see the same result for Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric. Southern California Edison, as I said, is somewhat less expensive, but even for them, regular rates are about double social marginal cost. San Diego Gas and Electric is the most expensive of the 3, and its rates are about triple social marginal cost. So we see very high rates, and we see very large gaps between social marginal cost, the efficient pricing benchmark, and the rates actually charged to residential customers. So why should we be worried about this? Why not collect? We got to pay for these costs somehow. Why not do it through electricity rates? One is efficiency. As we try to decarbonize the economy, and as we increasingly recognize that electrification has to play a major role in that, when you charge very high electricity rates, you discourage customers from switching from other energy sources. For electric vehicles, that would be switching from gasoline. For electric space and water heating, that would be switching from on-site natural gas combustion. And those are really considered the primary ways that we can lower household greenhouse gas footprints. And when we charge very high rates, as in some other work I've done with Jim Bushnell, we showed it actually changes the economics of buying an electric vehicle. In California, we estimate that if we priced gasoline, natural gas, and electricity at their social marginal costs, an EV would be about $500 per year more attractive. Electric water heating would be about $150 per year more attractive. And electric space heating would also be about $150 per year more attractive. So high rates are a real problem when you're thinking about electrifying everything, as is often discussed these days. The other concern is equity. Higher prices, as I will talk about next, impose a large economic burden on low-income households. Now, some people in California respond and say, well, we have a program for low-income households. And there are 2 problems with that argument. One is that, as I showed you, even for low-income households, prices are very high. And when you put another social program or another cost into rates, whether it's fighting wildfires or paying for R&D or whatever, yes, it raises the price by more for regular customers, but it raises the price even for low-income customers by about 65 to 70% as much because of the 30 to 35% fixed discount. So it still has a significant effect on raising rates for even low-income customers. So higher electricity prices are borne disproportionately by low-income customers, and that's a real equity issue as we move towards electrification. We wanted to understand why rates are so high, and so we created these what we call waterfall graphs. what they do, there are two staircases. The lower staircase, which goes out to here, to GHG pollution, is just replicating the analysis that I showed you before, where we have the social marginal cost as generation, capacity costs, and pollution costs, including both the ones that are market costs and the ones that are non-market costs. The upper staircase, which starts here, are costs that are not part of social marginal cost. So, you know, as we showed you, social marginal cost is actually pretty low relative to the full rate. Most of the rate is paying for non-marginal costs. So what's in those? Well, if we start out here in the public purpose programs, we have things like paying for energy efficiency programs, paying for the low income program, subsidies for rooftop solar through the net energy metering, which basically says that you can sell back to the utility for the full retail rate. And we calculate how much that raises rates, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. This big pink box is the non-marginal cost of distribution systems. Now, once you put in the poles and string the wires or run the underground trenches in some areas, most distribution costs are fixed costs. So they're not marginal to consumption. Now, as we plug in more EVs and other electrification, it does raise the utilization and in some cases requires upgrades, but the marginal cost of providing more electricity is still well below the full cost. The difference is this pink box. What's also in here increasingly in California and in many parts of the US is costs of climate change adaptation. So in California, we're doing huge investments to reduce fire risk from the distribution wires. And so that's part of what's in there. Transmission, also we have a lot of investment now, both to accommodate renewables and to mitigate wildfire risk. And then generation. If I went back to the box, you would see that the generation cost, this generation cost has actually declined over time. We had a very big investment in new renewables about a decade ago when they were really quite expensive. And those contracts are starting to roll off. So the margin between the actual marginal price of providing more electricity and paying for those very expensive full price contracts, which are essentially sunk costs now, has gotten smaller, but that's still a lot of what's driving these high prices. And it's not just renewables, I should say, it's also some very expensive contracts signed for conventional electricity, both nuclear power and also natural gas fired power plants back when natural gas was a lot more expensive. California, by the way, doesn't really burn coal anymore either. It doesn't burn any coal in state for electricity, and even the contracts for imported electricity have greatly declined over time. Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric look pretty much the same. Again, Southern California Edison is not quite as expensive. San Diego has had by far the biggest build out of rooftop solar. And as you can see in this lower graph, that has a big effect on electricity prices. Of the about nearly 29 cents per kilowatt hour, about 4.5 cents is due to subsidies for rooftop solar. Much smaller in Southern California Edison territory. There is this sort of virtuous or vicious cycle in places like San Diego, vicious cycle in San Diego, where rates are high, people are more incentivized to install rooftop solar. They install rooftop solar, they pay for less electricity from the grid. Those fixed costs that spread over fewer kilowatt hours, the price goes up. That incentivizes more people to invest in rooftop solar and so forth. At this point, somebody generally asks, why don't we just have dynamic pricing? And we love dynamic pricing. It's an important part of an efficient system. But dynamic pricing is relevant to this lower staircase. That's where the marginal cost. If you had efficient dynamic pricing, you would pay for this lower staircase through the time varying prices, and that would more efficiently capture these variable costs. It has nothing to do with these fixed costs, though. To the extent dynamic pricing reduces capacity needs, that's down here in the lower staircase. These are costs in the upper staircase that are not part of marginal energy supply, and so dynamic pricing really wouldn't solve that problem. As I talked about before, net metering for rooftop solar shifts the cost recovery burden substantially. Basically, when people install rooftop solar, they save the retail price, but the utility only saves that marginal cost, the private marginal cost. And the difference in revenue has to be made up somewhere, and it's made up in California by raising rates for everyone else. In PG&E territory, we calculate that for regular non-care customers, it raises annual bills by nearly $150 per year, even for customers on low income programs, again, because of that percentage differential, it raises annual bills by about $100 per year. In San Diego, the numbers are much larger because they have a whole lot more rooftop solar. So then we started thinking about the burden and how is this allocated? And in this report, and we're now working on a more detailed study, I'll talk about it in a minute, we use the Consumer Expenditure Survey from the US federal government, which surveys a small set of customers, well, a large set of households in the US, about 2,500 in California, for their expenditures across the income spectrum. And from that, we get this graph that's on the right. And what the important point here is these green dots along the lowest line, those are the expenditures on electricity. All of this is relative to the lowest quintile, the poorest 20% in the economy. Yes, wealthier people spend more on electricity than poor people, but in California, they don't spend a lot more. In fact, they spend about twice as much, even though their income, which is shown on the blue line, is 17 times as high. So poorer households spend a much larger share of their income on electricity than wealthier households do. And for comparison, because we're going to talk about alternatives, we also show a few other measures. One is gasoline expenditures. That's this yellow line. And that goes up. That's about 3 times as high for the richest households than the poorest. And expenditures on goods generally, and on goods that are subject to our sales tax, which are about 4 times as high for the richest households as the poorest. A flat tax on income would collect about 17 times more from the richest households than the poorest households. And I think that's an important comparison because essentially what we're doing here is we're taxing electricity consumption to pay for these fixed costs, to pay for a regular electricity infrastructure, but that's a declining share of that difference. A lot of it's to pay for climate change adaptation and mitigation, to pay for public purpose programs such as energy efficiency programs, subsidies for rooftop solar, subsidies for low income. You can think of all that as a tax above the marginal cost of providing electricity in order to cover those costs. We have chosen, there are many ways one could pay for those costs. We have chosen to pay for those costs through higher electricity prices. And we've chosen to do it by just raising the volumetric price on electricity. And for the very poorest households, the about 1/4 of households that are on the low income program, we even raise their rates, but though by 30 to 35% less. At this point, wealthier households actually consume only slightly more net electricity from the grid than poorer households. The reason they pay twice as much on average is because of the low income program and because California has a couple of fees that you can't really avoid through rooftop solar. But what's happened over the last decade is the rooftop solar has gone in very disproportionately in wealthier households. And as that's happened, the wealthier household net consumption, the part they have to pay for through net energy metering under the net energy metering program, has declined substantially to the extent that net consumption from those wealthier households is now only slightly greater than for the very poorest households. So the implication is we have a volumetric tax on electricity that is more regressive than a sales or gasoline tax, and far, far more regressive than an income tax. We are choosing to pay for all these additional social costs through possibly the most regressive tax one could come up with. So one solution, of course, is to stop doing it. And I have been quite vocal in California and talked to many of the stakeholders. There is remarkable agreement. Organizations like environmental groups, low-income ratepayer advocates, and the utilities, the three groups that hardly ever agree on anything, agree that it would be a good idea to pay for more of the state policy priorities through the state budget and less of it through electricity rates. The place there's much less agreement is among state legislators, of course, who like mandating activities, creating social programs, and not having to put it on the state budget and saying, just pay for it through electricity rates. So pretty much everywhere outside the Capitol building, there's widespread agreement, but in the Capitol, there certainly is not. Because of that, and because when we were working on this project at the beginning of the pandemic, it looked like the state budget was going to be a disaster, which it has not turned out to be at all. We started thinking about alternatives, and the alternative we focused on was what we call an income-based fixed charge. So putting costs onto fixed charges instead of volumetric is a good way to lower the volumetric price and to get to a more efficient electricity price. But if you just have a uniform fixed charge across all households, that has horrible distributional consequences. It's incredibly inequitable. It would actually balance even more of these costs on the lowest income customers. So the idea was, can we create a fixed charge that is actually income-based and pair that with an efficient volumetric price that reflects social marginal cost? And the report we put out examines alternative ways this can be done. Franchise Tax Board is the equivalent of the Internal Revenue Service for the state of California. And so that is the tax authority. It would have to involve the tax authority to do this. And we talk in detail about ways to do this, where you either declare to the utility and then the Franchise Tax Board says, you were in actually a different category, you have to pay more or less, or the Franchise Tax Board could transfer information on what income bracket each customer's household is in. And so there are various different ways to do it, or do it through a third party. And you could even have different fixed charges by location. And so you could sort of have a default fixed charge, and people could apply for a lower fixed charge if they have a lower income than that neighborhood average. It would be complicated. This is not a straightforward thing to do. It in some ways would be unprecedented. However, we do have other programs that operate this way. The Earned Income Tax Credit in the US is basically a program where when you get to your tax return, the tax authority decides what category you're in and how much you qualify to get from the Earned Income Tax Credit. And the US Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, also has a low-income subsidy that's actually implemented through the tax authority. What would be different here is this would actually be coordination with non-governmental investor-owned utilities to have this sort of subsidy. That said, what we did is we created a sort of straw proposal, and we said, well, what if we did have income-based fixed charges? And just to sort of nail things down, we said, what if we had a zero fixed charge for the lowest quintile of customers? And then we had an increasing fixed charge that was progressive to the extent to match the progressivity of other sorts of taxes. So this yellow line matches the progressivity of a sales tax. If we had an income-based fixed charge that was as progressive as the sales tax, first I should say, if we just wanted to get volumetric prices down to social marginal cost and charge everyone the same fixed charge, it would be on the order of $75 per customer. An income-based fixed charge that was as progressive as a sales tax, for the very richest customers, it would be about $150 per month. This is monthly fixed charges. Something as progressive as an income tax would be even more, as a flat tax on income would give you a price about $180 per month of fixed charge. We focus on the sales tax progressivity. We think that that's sort of potentially feasible. It is important to recognize that, well, those look like really big fixed charges. They actually wouldn't raise bills by anywhere near as much, because remember, while we would be charging the wealthiest customers a pretty big monthly fixed charge, they'd have a much lower marginal cost per kilowatt hour. So bill changes would actually, for the very richest customers, would be about $60 per month. The bill changes for other customers would be about neutral. For the next category would be a slight change, for a slight decrease for the middle income bracket. This increase for the low income customers is because there's this set of customers who would be who wouldn't qualify for the zero fixed charge, but would this is coupled with ending the low income program, so their costs would go up slightly. And then for the poorest customers, there would be very big savings, particularly very big savings relative to their income. So this would undo the regressivity of the current approach. One of the concerns that people talk about is, well, if we do this, won't we cause grid defection? People would actually just cut the cord. And if you do the calculation, the answer is not many and no time soon, because if you're thinking about grid defection, they would be focused on, well, what's the overall bill, not just the fixed charge, and that lower marginal cost would offset the fixed charge. It would also create huge opportunities for new electricity use. So if you were thinking of putting in a hot tub, if you were thinking of putting in electric heat, there are lots of things that look attractive when you're paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour that don't look attractive when you're paying 26 cents a kilowatt hour. The customers who would pay more at their current consumption levels are relatively wealthy households with relatively low consumption. That's the sort of category, relatively low consumption from the grid. And that either means they're very small households that consume little electricity, and they're likely, in that case, they're likely multifamily dwellings, which are very unlikely to drop off the grid, or they're actually wealthy households that have installed solar and pay only for their net consumption. So they right now have very low bills because of their rooftop solar, and their bills would go up quite a bit. The question is, enough that they would actually cut the cord. And when you do the math, it seems pretty unlikely. Even for a top quintile customer who consumes only 1/3 of the average household from the grid, their bill would go up by $100 a month. So this is a pretty case for a pretty large solar customer who has wiped out most of their consumption. That means that their cost would go up by about $1,200 a year. And when you think about it, would a wealthy customer be willing to leave the grid, cut the cord, to save $1,200 a year? When you think about the cost of batteries, which are still very expensive, and even a 27 kilowatt hour battery, which is not enough to give you real reliability in the winter, costs $15,000 to $20,000. So it seems unlikely, until batteries get massively cheaper, that anyone's likely to leave the grid because of this fixed charge. So I'll wrap up here. California has volumetric rates that are used for lots of things other than actually paying for incremental costs of electricity. You know, in the old days, this wasn't a real problem. People didn't have choices. It was still an equity issue, but it wasn't an efficiency issue because people really couldn't do something different. But now we want people to electrify. And so if we charge very high rates and they have the option to use natural gas or to use gasoline for vehicles for heating and space heating and transportation, we're really discouraging that when we charge very high volumetric rates. It also amounts to a highly regressive tax in order to pay for social programs that is just very inequitable. We're charging the lowest income customers in California a disproportionate share of the cost of these social programs. There are ways to change the way these costs are recovered and reduce electricity rates, volumetric rates, to help ensure affordable and attractive electricity consumption so that people actually have an incentive to switch from natural gas or gasoline to electricity as we try to decarbonize the economy. And we talk about both paying for this through the government budget and paying for it through income fixed charges, which would improve equity and help the lowest income households afford this transition to a cleaner economy. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions and discuss the work and the issues more broadly.
Great, thank you so much, Severin. Really thoughtful paper on an important topic, particularly with all the discussions around electrification and the shift towards more clean and low carbon based economy. So just to remind everyone, if you've got some questions, we've got a couple of options. You can either type them into Q&A or you can raise your hand and then we can come to you and ask you to ask your question live to Severin. But maybe I'll just kick things off, Severin, and I'm curious as to the major policy factors that have led to this increasing wedge between rates that have been increasing in California, particularly over the last decade, and a decreasing marginal cost. And I note from your slide that shows the residential prices over time, it looked like something changed around 2012. And we see that was the low point. It looked like there was some change in the environment. So maybe you could provide a little bit of background in terms of what were some of the major policy factors that contributed to this increasing divergence.
Yeah, when you look at these gaps over time, you see, as I pointed out, and as you're raising, you see that sort of the cost narrowing between California and the rest of the country right in around 2010, and then widening again. California, that's when California started really diving in on climate programs. And so we started seeing more and more of these programs being paid for through electricity bills, through electricity prices, signing a lot of contracts for what were then very expensive renewables. So we were signing contracts for solar power, which now sells for probably the equivalent sort of amount and quality, sells for $30 a megawatt hour. And we signed contracts then for $150 to $200 a megawatt hour. So it was way out of the money. We also signed contracts, unfortunately not timed well, before the price of natural gas really came down. So this actually started a few years earlier, as during the boom just before the financial crisis, at pretty expensive prices, reflecting pretty high natural gas prices. And those were still on the books. And so California got squeezed both in increasing its costs of the social programs or of climate mitigation and just some badly timed contracts. Now, the climate mitigation also came with, over the last decade, increasing investment in rooftop solar. And as I pointed out, the rooftop solar has this vicious cycle quality to it, which is, as people do it, they save money, but everybody else has to pay for that. And then lastly, but this actually isn't the explanation for most of the years, only in the last couple of years, we've seen since 2018 or so, increasing investment in grid hardening and climate mitigation, or sorry, climate adaptation, paid for through the electricity prices. And so just in the last few years, well, actually, San Diego Gas and Electric started earlier, and that is part of what happened in San Diego. They had a major fire in 2007. And after that, they started investing in all the technology and grid hardening, including remote sensing of wildfires, that has gone in again to volumetric rates.
Right, so a combination of different factors. Would it be fair to say that as jurisdictions invest more and more in renewables, then you're going to see an increasing wedge between marginal costs coming down? You've got that fixed cost in the infrastructure, but the marginal costs of production are much lower, and that puts maybe greater pressure or creates a greater incentive to think about this marginal cost pricing.
It's hard to know, actually. So a couple of things are going on. This is a sort of more complex than people often give it credit for. First of all, renewables generally have just gotten incredibly cheap. So the cost of a new solar plus 4 hours of storage contract is these days in California, admittedly with the federal subsidies, below $30 a megawatt hour. So it's gotten really 3 cents a kilowatt hour for comparison. It's gotten quite inexpensive. It is true that the marginal cost of solar and wind once installed is pretty much zero, but that's not where the wholesale market's going to go, because you still have to balance the system. And so you're going to have either batteries providing marginal services, and batteries do have a marginal cost. It's the cost of charging at other times. Or you're going to still have some natural gas or other resources at the margin. And even if it's hydro is energy limited. And so the hydro seller or owners don't sell you that stuff for free because it's capacity. They have a limited amount of it. And so we're not going to see the fear that is often expressed that the price will always be zero. It's not going to be zero. It is likely to go down, though. My guess is that difference between the cost we have to cover for energy and the marginal cost from the wholesale market is not going to be a major factor in driving costs up further. The bigger factor, and the one that California Public Utilities Commission and the utilities and many others are pointing to, is paying for wildfire mitigation. We are spending a huge amount and other climate change adaptation. We're spending a huge amount right now on grid hardening, vegetation management, and so forth in order to control costs. And as those go in, the forecast the CPUC has put out, the regulator has put out, suggests that they could drive up costs another 30%, 40% over the next decade.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Severin. That's great. Let me turn to Brian now. I think Brian's got a question to ask.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. Also, I just want to let everybody know on the attendees.
Brian, I
could
can
you
barely hear you.
Yeah, can you?
Something's going on.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Yes. Just to remind folks as well that are attending, please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to ask Severin a question, or post your question in the Q&A, and I'll try and get to it. So Severin, you might not be surprised to hear this, but this issue of residual cost recovery, the implications for equity and efficiency, something that some of the provinces in Canada are also looking at, particularly Alberta and Ontario. One of the issues that has come up is this issue of grid defection. People, because of the volumetric charges, particularly larger customers, saying maybe it's cheaper for me to self-supply, build my own generation. There are these distributed energy resources as well at the household level that might become more cost-effective because of these volumetric charges. You talked about grid defection in the sense of shifting from the current volumetric charges to perhaps going to fixed charges. But do you have any evidence that there is this inefficient grid defection happening within California? How do we distinguish between efficient distributed generation investment versus grid investment, et cetera? I wonder if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I know I have lots of thoughts. So let me address a couple of things. One is, how do you distinguish between efficient and inefficient DER investments? And just yesterday, we had a meeting at the Energy Institute here at Haas with a number of people from the regulator and from the utilities. And I asked this very question. I said, so let's say we somehow figured out how to pay for all of these other costs and we managed to lower prices to reflect social marginal cost. Which distributed energy resource? This was a panel that was making the point, DERs aren't a single thing. There are a lot of different things. They're rooftop solar, they're managed charging of EVs, they're batteries, et cetera. Which would survive if the retail rate actually reflects social marginal cost? It's pretty clear that rooftop solar would have a tough time. It really doesn't compete very well with social marginal cost of consumption from the grid. The batteries would probably still have some place, particularly where people are looking for resilience, but the resilience and rooftop solar could have some value, but the batteries alone will get you most of what you want. It won't get you a week-long outage, but it'll get you a multi-hour outage. So it might be people would still install batteries, but wouldn't install solar. And then the what is also being called DERs from grid management, say electric vehicle charging and so forth, would almost certainly survive. So, the answer to the DER part, I think, is complicated, and it's important to unpack which DERs. Now, your other question, I've forgotten your other question. What was your first question?
Yeah, my first question is kind of related, I guess.
Oh, grid defection, right. So grid defection, so we had one of my PhD students, Will Gorman, has done some really good work with Duncan Calloway, a professor here, and Stephen Jarvis, another one, a former PhD student, looking at, well, what are the economics of grid defection, of really cutting the cord for residential customers? And the answer is, if you want anything like the reliability of the grid, like even 99.9% uptime, which is still much lower than people expect, you really have to invest a huge amount in charging. And I will tell one story. I have another former student who lives in a tiny house, what is now the sort of tiny house movement, off the grid. And she has solar panels and a composting toilet and so forth. And I said, so now that you've done this for a year, what have you learned? And she said, what I've learned is anyone who would choose to live off the grid when the grid is there and available is just nuts. It is so much work. It requires so much attention and constant thinking about, do we have enough power? Can we do this? Are we going to run out of power if it's a cloudy day and so forth, that you really need to be willing to pay a lot of attention to it. Now, combine that with who would be doing the grid defection, who are disproportionately the wealthiest people in society. And I think there just isn't much of a margin. And what Will showed in his dissertation, or showing, he hasn't graduated yet, is that is indeed the case. The cost of getting the sort of reliability that I think most particularly wealthier customers want is so high. You'd have to invest in so much battery capacity that it's just not plausible. Not only is it not really plausible in California, it's not even particularly plausible in Hawaii, where the rates are even higher and the solar resource is better. So I think that it could happen when batteries get a whole lot cheaper, but when batteries get a whole lot cheaper, if we're really dumb and we continue to load everything into electricity bills, yeah, we could cause grid defection. But at that point, I think it's really going to force our hand and say, we got to pay for these other programs some other way.
Great, thanks. So Severin, I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. This is coming from the audience, and that's a question about, what does this look like from the utility perspective? So if you're proposing a drastic reduction in average rates to social marginal cost and a corresponding increase in the fixed rates, presumably this is going to increase the demand for electricity. So what does this mean for utilities that might need to invest in additional infrastructure to cope with that type of demand?
Well, the utilities are pretty excited about it. They particularly in the US and in many parts of the world now, they are in the wires business. They're sort of out of the generation business. They contract for generation in many places, but their job is to provide the wires. And it would actually require some real upgrading. And that's part of the cost we're looking at, that capacity cost, that they could do the investment in. They don't want it to happen so fast that they can't keep up. And there are concerns in some places, and California is one of them, that during the transition, we would see we could see some problems. California is about to close down our last nuclear power plant in 2024. And there's concern about where's that power going to come from, and where's the capacity to deliver it going to come from. The ones who are not happy about it, and this relates to Katie Hausman's talk at the last session, are the gas utilities. The gas utilities are desperately trying to come up with ways to still be relevant. There are two big gas utilities in California. One, and they're a great contrast. One is PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a combined utility, and they're fine. Their view is, if we transition out of gas, we get the other end of the business, and we got to figure out how to pay for it still, the stranded investment. The other is Southern California Gas Company, and they're not fine. They are quite worried about what this does to them as a company. Interestingly, they are owned by Sempra, a holding company that also owns San Diego Gas and Electric. So there's a bit of tension within the company, but SoCal Gas is really quite aggressively trying to figure out how this could be avoided through reducing the greenhouse gas footprint of continuing to use their pipes. Now, that probably means putting something different through the pipes. Hydrogen is a possibility, and renewable natural gas is a possibility. And there's a lot of discussion of the chemistry of how to create things that you can still run through the pipes without causing pipe problems. Hydrogen, it leaks a lot more, and it causes the pipes to get brittle. So from the utility perspective, the real concern is on the gas side. On the electric side, they are quite open to this and have been very supportive of the idea of taking things off bills entirely. And they have for years been supportive of higher fixed charges in California. But the ratepayer advocates have really opposed them because of the concerns about equity. And the income-based fixed charge is something that the ratepayer advocates have also become pretty supportive of. Yeah. So I'm optimistic that there is widespread support for making these rates less regressive. I'm less optimistic that the legislature is going to step up on this. The political reality is it's just so easy to create new programs when the legislature doesn't have to pay for them. So they show up as a mandate, renewable portfolio standard, low income subsidies, a net metering program. But what the impact is to raise residential and commercial industrial, which we haven't talked about here, but rates.
Yeah. I feel like we need a part two to continue this conversation. Well, we're already over time, so I think we should draw it to a close here. And apologies to the folks who have asked questions we haven't been able to get to. Thank you so much, Severin. It's great to see you and to learn a little bit about what's coming out in California in terms of some real thought leadership. So thank you again for an engaging presentation. And I'll turn it now back to Brian.
Thanks for having me. It was a real honor to join you.
Let me just say again as well, thank you, Severin. Really appreciate you participating today in the Ivey community. I'm sure that everybody appreciates hearing from you. Again, also apologies if we haven't been able to get to your questions. We appreciate the questions, just ran short of time. So I guess this closes off our 5th annual workshop this year. Thanks to all those the speakers, moderators, and all those who've attended. We look forward to next year's session. I'd also like again thank our sponsors, the Alberta Electric System Operator and the Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator. Thank you very much for your support. And thank you to the Ivey Energy Consortium and Mr. Ted Kernahan for continuing to support the Energy Center. So with that, I say thank you, and until next year, we'll meet again. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.